There are big sections of the country right now that had some sort of local news outlet that now have next to none. And that's on top of all the ones that had already been losing their local news outlets. And again, speaking here of written word type news outlets, the not radio or television. So it's been pretty devastating. And it's behind the scenes, you might say, and even on top of the scenes, it's a huge topic of conversation in journalism now, is how are people gonna try to fill in those gaps, and not only that, among a certain sort of subset of journalists, it's like, how do we transform the whole ownership model so that we don't end up with so many news outlets owned by vertically integrated corporations or hedge funds that have no interest in keeping them going for the good of the community and are basically just looking to cash out as fast as possible.
Journalist Emily Gertz returns to the Plutopia News Network podcast for an in-depth conversation about the state of journalism. Emily is senior editor for Drill News, an online publication covering climate accountability. Drill News investigates the various drivers of delay on climate action. Our conversation starts, like many these days, discussing COVID-19.
And I got one of those loud buzz telephone alerts this morning, like an Amber Alert, but this one was saying that you're mandated to wear masks. So suddenly Texas is taking this our government is taking this very seriously, our governor.
Yeah. I mean, I pin most of it on Trump, needless to say, but nonetheless, all of your governors got to watch New York and New Jersey and New Orleans and Massachusetts get taken to their knees by this thing, and that no one took it seriously after watching that has flabbergasted me. It's totally like Trump's mind over matter aura, extending to these Republican governors who, it's horrible to watch. I feel like we learned this huge lesson here for everyone else to draw upon, and people are being. No, but it isn't happening in so many places,
We're like the naughty kid that parents would point to and say, if you don't behave yourself, you'll end up like him. And just before I came into the studio, I was watching a report on CNN comparing Canada's response and their results compared to our non-results. And they're ready to open because they actually paid attention to the science and kept their numbers down. I mean, they didn't, avoid deaths and stuff, but there was nothing compared to what we're experiencing here. And I'm sure Trump hates that because he hates Canada.
He does seem to have it in for Trudeau.
Oh, yes. Now Trudeau's number one in the good category.
Yeah. Which, when you talk to Canadians, is quite an accomplishment. He appears to have let just about every constituency down in some significant way, but he's good in a crisis.
I thought that was what politicians were supposed to do, is let you down.
That's true. Yeah, I don't know. It's well, you live in this country too. You know what it is.
Yep.
It's a weird feeling that, even could I travel, Europe would not let me in.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. But fortunately, I believe states north of me will let me in. My sister and I are starting to try to plan something. My sister and her family live in Western Mass. Just her and her husband at this point, but and the caseload's been very light in their part of Massachusetts. It was heaviest around the Boston area and just north of New Haven. But Massachusetts has brought it way down as well. So I don't think they'll stop me at the state line and quiz me. I think the governors have all coordinated pretty well on that. So,
well, John and me won't be able to drop by your place for tea anytime soon because we're on the no-fly list for sure, thanks to Texas' poor showing.
God. Yeah, I mean, the mayors wanted to implement a mask order, right? And the governor wouldn't let them.
Yeah, the governor wouldn't let them at the time.
It was unpatriotic to demand mask.
And, you know, there's still a huge controversy about it. And there was one Texas guy on Facebook that was telling me the other day, well, one thing was that I said that that Trump could have acted to prevent the spread of the virus. And the guy suggested that I was saying that Trump must be God because only God could prevent the spread of the virus.
Oh, man.
I mean, that's the level of ignorance that we're dealing with here.
Yeah. Well, we have...
Or blind allegiance.
Well, there is a lot of that, too.
We have Ignorance Center here in Austin with that lovely news, that's in quotes, service, InfoWars. Alex Jones and his band of crazies have been doing anti-mask protests at the state capitol. He shows up in his huge armored vehicle with his bullhorn and incites everyone to defend their liberty.
Yeah.
And then he's seen later leaving with a mask on.
He is one cynical bastard.
There is somebody with a bar somewhere that says that, you know, that it would be communism to require people to wear masks. And my response to that was, you know, does this mean that you don't wear a seatbelt? Does this mean you don't stop at a red light? Basically, they're saying that any legal requirement is communism and a restriction on freedom.
Well,
you know, we have all kinds of restrictions on our freedoms.
Yeah, you have a right to be stupid.
Yeah.
Now we said, and Emily was our guest before on one of our live stream sessions, and we'll hopefully come back for another one of those in the future. But one thing that we agreed was that we wanted to have a serious discussion about the state of journalism. I have kind of a journalism background. Scoop does too. And Emily is like a full-time environmental journalist who knows a lot about what's going on in journalism now. We can have, I think, a fairly well-informed discussion of that, especially from Emily, who has been thinking about it a lot. And I guess a good way to get started on that is to just kind of ask Emily, kind of from your perspective, what's happening right now to keep journalism alive? It has seemed that many news organizations were challenged, you know, financially, and have had other challenges too. So what's actually working right now?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the pod. It's great to be back.
Welcome.
So what's working in journalism right now? Well, we are in a really rough patch, and let's just specify that we'll be talking about the United States news industry here, and not television. So my work has always been in online news, and I know quite a bit about the online news situation. So this has been a really devastating quarter, you might say, for American journalism. The last count I saw was that, was it 38,000 jobs? I should have looked this up before I came on. Not just a few jobs, but actually tens of thousands of journalism jobs disappeared with the onset of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders around the country, because the way some outlets were adjusting their business model, was to create new revenue streams with events. And this has been, up until this moment, one of the really bright spots in in the transition of the journalism model from a really heavy reliance on advertising to a more diversified revenue stream that helps you ride out bumps. But the pandemic forced outlets to cancel live events, and then even more so dried up advertising super quickly because other places were closing. So restaurants, concert venues, whatever your local advertising scene was, it pretty much cratered. And so that, I know, led to several just flat out closures of smaller independents early on in the spring, and followed by a slight lag and then a similar drop off in advertising at some of the bigger, like regional news outlets, sort of called newspapers. They're regional newspapers, but although they all now pretty much publish online as well, those outlets began to either lay people off or furlough them, or cut hours. So some combination of those things happened in a big sweep across many outlets, and in some cases, for instance, I know there's a company up in the Midwest that owns several small community papers that were publishing, like, say, twice a week. They just folded those things entirely. So there are big sections of the country right now that had some sort of local news outlet that now have next to none. And that's on top of all the ones that had already been losing their local news outlets. And again, speaking here of written word type news outlets, the not radio or television. So it's been pretty devastating. And it's behind the scenes, you might say, and even on top of the scenes, it's a huge topic of conversation in journalism now, is how are people going to try to fill in those gaps. And not only that, among a certain sort of subset of journalists, it's like, how do we transform the whole ownership model so that we don't end up with so many news outlets owned by vertically integrated corporations or hedge funds that have no interest in keeping them going for the good of the community and are basically just looking to cash out as fast as possible. One thing I'll add too is that kind of the third wave of what happened this spring was it finally began to hit at some of the bigger digital outlets, and most shockingly for some of us, digital outlets that looked like they were doing gangbusters. The Atlantic laid off a bunch of people, for instance, and their subscription numbers have gone way up since the coronavirus crisis began, because they are covering the Trump administration's reactions and responses quite heavily. But when you look at it a little more closely, for instance, they laid off their whole events team, which is in keeping with the first wave of events shutting down, because the Atlantic had a strong events revenue stream as well, but they're not, I'm sure, anticipating that coming back anytime soon. And I believe they also laid off most of their video team. So it's the outlets where I don't see layoffs happening are kind of the ones you'd expect. The national outlets that have made the leap finally into online very solidly. The New York Times, the Washington Post, some of the nonprofit news outlets, like I haven't heard of any layoffs at, say, ProPublica or Reveal, although don't hold me to that definitively. So it's not a great time for the business of news in America.
My fear is I'm sure there's a focus group going on at all these big networks that have been having to do what we're doing right now online. And they're saying, well, we used to send out cameramen and our camera people, sound people, along with the reporter, and other staff to help get the interview going. And we've been doing it with one person online. Why don't we get rid of all of these people permanently? And I can imagine there's going to be some of that after the virus is gone.
And actually, I think that has been the trend in TV news for several years now. Reporters have had to become basically solo unit, setting up the camera, getting sound, doing the live cast. That's not, I don't think that is so unusual anymore anyway, thanks to a lot of the cost cutting that was happening in the past 10 or 15 years anyway. But that's true. There could be another sort of drop off in that kind of employment if they can't be sending reporters out on the scene, or if they choose not to, then yeah, those people are in a lot of trouble, I guess.
Who's got it figured out? I mean, who's doing well right now?
Well, again, you've got major national news outlets like the Times and the Post, and are doing well, from what I understand. They have a lot, but they have a lot of resources to bring to bear on doing well, and I'm not just talking about the fact that the Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, although I'm sure that's very helpful. Yeah. But they've, just what seems to be happening is a concentration of news coverage upward, like sort of out of localities and into national news. But that said, your question was who's doing well right now, like who's getting it right. This events model was doing it right up until the pandemic. Like in Texas, I think we talked about last time I was on the show, Texas Tribune really cracked that nut, for instance. And there are some nonprofit news outlets that seem to be thriving. And those would include, say, ProPublica, which is kind of become the granddaddy of a certain kind of news model for nonprofit news, where they're combining grants and some earned revenue through various products that they offer. And they also do like pledge drives or membership drives with their readers. I believe Reveal / the Center for Investigative Reporting is also a nonprofit investigative outfit. And I don't know exactly how they're doing, but they have endured, they continue to produce investigative reporting. They have their great podcast radio show, which is also a podcast now on public radio stations. I've heard they're doing well. And niche outlets are also finding some success. So in the climate space, Inside Climate News appears to be doing really well. They've expanded quite a bit, and they now have, from just having, I think, a concentrated newsroom covering big picture, top down, like national scene, international scene. They now have reporters they have a reporter in the West, they have a reporter in the Southeast. So they're building out a local news network. I don't know if they're bringing in revenue in any way other than grants and reader donations, but they seem to be thriving. Again, I don't have inside knowledge on this. It's just my impressions. But I know some of the people who got some of those jobs, and they were very happy to get them. So
I think some publications have profit centers other than just, news. I mean, they may have a paywall to pay for news. They may be ad-based, but they also find other kinds of revenue sources that the one that I was just thinking about, I know the Dallas Morning News had done that in a big way, and I can't remember exactly. I saw a talk on this, and I can't remember all that they were doing, but there was a substantial amount of additional revenue that was not was only kind of related to their main work of delivering the news. And the New Yorker, of course, has all kinds of other things that they do. They sell products and so forth. And they
Well,
seem
that's
to
a
do
whole,
really well.
yeah. I mean, when you're looking at the New Yorker, you're looking at a part of a major publishing enterprise, Condé Nast. So there's a lot to learn from the New Yorker in terms of how they made a really good transition from print to online. I don't know what it would say about the business state of news, because when you're in a company like that, it isn't just a question of how you're doing, it's of how the whole company is doing. You mentioned paywalls, and yes, paywalls are coming on in a big way. In the earliest phase of going online in the late 90s, early 2000s, most publications did not use paywalls, even though they were selling subscriptions, paper subscriptions, and they tried to build out the advertising, online
Yeah,
advertising.
exactly. They were trying to be kind of like television, strictly ad based.
Right, but that backfired, obviously. So fast forward, of course, close to 15, 20 years, and you do see papers. Again, the big ones are able to do this. The Boston Globe, the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times have all the Times and some other papers are putting paywalls back in, or have already done so. The Times again and the Post are proving to be very successful with their paywalls. A significant amount of readership subscriptions coming in. But it is a difficult model because people got so used to having all that stuff at their fingertips for nothing for so long. So and then so it's definitely helping some publications, and this is a model that some of the online publications are either also adopting or are doing a kind of hybrid model where like with Politico, for instance, there's the regular Politico site, and then there's Politico Pro, which is their value added news reporting, you might say, and for that you have to subscribe. Talking Points Memo, which is one of the survivors from the 2000s that does sort of center progressive news
Josh
commentary. Yes, I mean they've paywalled a lot of their content, and they do membership drives, and it seems to be working. But again, the problem is for local community papers. I don't know how well the paywall model is working, because they're just so much smaller that right away there's a technology hump that they have to get over. A big enterprise can bring on a team dedicated to managing the technology. But there is an organization called Lion, Local Independent Online News, maybe.
Yeah,
but
right.
But so that's what a group like Lion is trying to do, is trying to help small local news outlets band together and form economies of scale, and so they can get the technology and the technology support they need. So
there's another effect of the paywalls that I don't think I've seen anybody talk about this, but it's in my head. I think this is probably something that's happening, and I can't cite any studies or any references for this, but I believe that as the higher quality publications resort more and more to paywalls, and they're locking out more and more people who don't really want to pay for news, those people are going to sources that are of lower quality. And some of those sources are in the category of what we have learned to refer to as fake news. So that may actually be driving the proliferation of fake news sites that don't have paywalls. They may be just ad-based, and they do pretty well with that. And many of those are heavily partisan, one way or another.
Yeah, the real problem with paywalls is, you can put one up, but if you don't have quality content that people really desire, you won't get a lot of money off of that. I've seen that happen on a number of publications who tried it, but they didn't have the content that really lured people in. They just wanted their money.
Yeah, it does. It did put a lot of publications' feet to the fire. That's true. And some people, who are paying attention to the business transformation in news, they sort of feel like that was inevitable. Like this part of this transition is you have to give consumers, let's just say, you have to give subscribers quality content, and because they're a click away. It's no longer a question of you're the local newspaper. No one else covers what you cover for the community. Chances are there is something else out there that at least looks like it's doing that. Maybe it's Facebook, as John, you mentioned, people going to social media. Maybe it's maybe a slightly bigger regional news outlet has picked up some of the local coverage, and then they have a lot of value add, like a bigger outfit can manage, like coverage of the whatever the regional hub city is, and the regional whatever the region's industries are, cooking, entertainment, all of those things. One thing I did want to mention on the topic, and this actually plays into misinformation as well. There are, what seems to be working pretty well right now, as I kind of began to mention before, is people going into very well-defined niches of news coverage, and at a large scale, an outlet like Inside Climate News is like that. Inside, by its very name, it covers climate change, energy in relation to climate change. But there are the newsletter business has exploded in the past few years, with reporters, really, professional journalists, building up newsletter subscriber bases by focusing very tightly on one topic and just pouring their expertise and energy into it. Last year, a reporter from the New Republic named Emily Atkin left the New Republic and launched her own newsletter called Heated, which covers climate. She was a climate reporter, and she came into it with a following from the New Republic, where she had a high profile, and she has a kind of she's taken on a no holds barred style at this point, just kind of very snarky and opinionated, but reported as well. And all this whole kismet of factors, like who she is, how she writes, how many people knew about her before she started, and there you have her newsletter, from I know for a fact has been doing absolutely great, like in terms of being a full-time job for her. And her niche is very tight. Again, she is covering the entities in our society that are continuing to try to block effective action on climate change. She takes a close look at advertising. She tracks sort of these soft campaigns that fossil fuel companies run to make themselves look like part of the solution. That's her niche, and people want to read it. And there's one of the in that space, one of the granddaddies is a niche newsletter called Cynicism, which the writer of that newsletter is a China expert. And so for many years, it used to be a mailing list, and then he went over to a paid newsletter format. Maybe the mailing list was also a paid format. And that one is apparently doing great because he's got something unique to offer, and he found a medium that people like using, and it works for him.
That's Bill Bishop.
I believe so.
Yeah.
So that has been a bright spot. But as you can kind of tell from how I describe it, it's not everyone is going to come up with a news, like there aren't going to be 20 really great climate newsletters, there's going to be a few. and so, that the newsletter side of it, how that can begin to play out into maybe filling some of these news deserts remains to be seen. But then the good thing there is that these local news deserts are the focus of a lot of innovation with, small to medium size operations getting online and bringing the quality coverage to the question. Let me look it up to make sure I've got it right. But in Colorado, after the Denver Post laid a whole bunch of people off, I believe some of them went on to found the Colorado Independent. Yes, and this is tricky because there's two things in Colorado. The other one is the Colorado Star. So let me make sure I've got the right one. But you get the idea. Like they took their expertise in covering Colorado and the West and have been parlaying that. Colorado Star. Theirs is the Colorado Star. Colorado Independent is another effort in that direction. I think more sort of definitively left of center, but you'd have to read it and kind of see where they are right now. So the Colorado Star is not only filling in for places where there is no longer news, they're also filling in for, in many ways, the Denver Post, which has been stripped bare, or if not bare, relatively close to it by its upper management, again, who are way up the top, ownership that is just more interested in profits than news as a public service. So that's super interesting and that's exciting. And it would be great to see these things, people like journalists finding ways to get enough of a runway monetarily to launch things like this in other parts of the country as well. Because I think you're right, Jon, that when a news site puts up a paywall, which many you have to do to run a particularly well-funded news operation, and that, even though that's just a piece of what you need to do, there is still, the Alex Joneses of the world pumping out,
Well, and also the nonprofits like the Texas Tribune, which is a very high quality news site that doesn't have a paywall, but they have a lot of donors. They're getting a lot of money that way, and they have a lot of support from bigger donors. Like
definitely. Found donors stepping in is a big part of the picture right now, definitely, and ProPublica, a big has donors in addition to subscribers, and they sell kind of data products as well that they develop through their online, through their investigative reporting. Donors are a huge piece of it right now, which is leading a lot of sort of conversation on whether the future of news in America is more nonprofit than profit. It's been a business for almost its entire, let's just say for the past, close to 120 years. It's been a business, and where basically newspapers sold eyeballs to advertisers.
Exactly. Yeah.
We also have the Texas Observer, which is a good source, and they are, a nonprofit, and they have been a good source for many years, for decades, of good investigative reporting. And because of their nonprofit, they don't have to worry about offending any advertisers, any sponsors that might want to not have things covered. And that's what you see in a lot of the commercial media is there's only some things you can cover. You can't step on the toes of the advertising people. And you see that a lot. That's what killed radio. Is radio became a big silo, really owned by just a few big corporations. And you talked about the local news desert. It created many local news deserts around the country for radio. They used to be all local, oriented stations that had local news, and now they're all just networked together. And you'll hear Rush Limbaugh on every one of them.
Yeah. And, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that some companies are one of the ways in which they're bringing in a lot of revenue that they can then direct into news is by setting up kind of these parallel sort of branding studios that simply put, create content-based advertising campaigns for clients, for corporations. Oh. And these are kind of so the Times has something like that. And if you look closely at a number of the online publications whose names you may have heard, like BuzzFeed, for instance, I believe has something like that. I'll look it up while I'm talking. But in any case, this is another way that some news outlets have tried to create a diverse revenue stream. Okay, take back BuzzFeed, I'm not sure. But again, this is kind of controversial because, for instance, at my news outlet, which is Drilled News, we're a startup. We are our funding is a combination of right now of donors and subscribers to our Patreon and subscribers to a newsletter that one of the podcasts is associated with. So please come visit us, drillednews.com. And my boss, essentially the founder of Drilled News, Amy Westervelt, has criticized the fact that a newspaper with so much invested in covering climate change accurately and deeply is also taking on its non-editorial side, on its business side, clients who are the companies responsible for impeding climate action and are trying to pass themselves off as now being part of the solution because of their investments in natural gas. And legitimately, a place like the Times says there is a firewall between those two operations. They never meet. They never influence each other. And I tend to believe that's true, but you can kind of see where this creates for newspapers. For news outlets that decide to take that kind of an operation on, it can be very, very profitable and fund a lot of great reporting. But then it does create challenges with, like, you have to make that content distinct, look distinct from the actual news, news that your company's putting out.
This is a good segue into a bigger question that I really want to talk about, the question of authority and the question of bias. And, for example, I was in a disagreement about one of the COVID issues with somebody, and I posted a link to a piece from Stat News.
Oh, sure. Stat News, great outlet.
And the response I got was, oh, well, Stat News was started by the Boston Globe, and it's a left-leaning, which is not true, but it's a left-leaning, publication. And basically what you have here is that if you cite traditionally authoritative sources, you have people who will say, well, those sources are biased. And there's a huge problem of who has actual authority for facts and for what's real and for news. And it's obviously so much worse in the era of Trump and in the era of, alternative facts and that sort of thing. But I think it was already a big problem before Trump ever hit office. As you have this proliferation of so many news sources and various silos appearing and that sort of thing, it's like, and then also you have the politicization and the polarization within the culture, all of these things have led us to a place where so many people just kind of don't believe anything anymore. I mean, if you're living in a world where people will say that Anthony Fauci is a liar who's telling a bunch of lies about COVID in order to fill his pockets, that's crazy talk. But that, there are sources where people look to them for authoritative sources, and they're saying stuff like that.
Yeah, then that gold mine of epidemiology.
Yeah, exactly.
You're right, gold mine. Yeah, I mean, the Pew Research Center published a study earlier this year that found that about 1/5, so that's like 20 out of say 100 people, are getting all their news from within a political bubble. So if you're a Democrat or in favor of ideas that the Democratic Party represents, you're 1 in 5 of you are seeing nothing but stuff that agrees with you, like through probably through the combination of those are the people online. Let's say those are the places you're visiting, and then a site like Facebook is keeping track of what you're visiting and where you stay the longest. And because for Facebook is essentially selling eyeballs, just like the newspapers of old, to advertisers, they want to keep you on their site, so they're going to throw up another link or another recommended read that is similar to the one you just read, and the result is that you're not getting exposed to differing viewpoints, and you're not just kind of running into serendipitously news stories that you might not have read otherwise, like when you were clicking through a website even, or paging through the newspaper and just something caught your eye. So 1/5 of people, I mean, that is huge. And their study actually did ask people if they considered themselves Democrats or Republicans, and the percentages were pretty equal for both. There is apparently, we talk a lot about the right-wing media sphere. Well, there is a left-wing media sphere as well. Yeah. It's not as virulent in some ways, but some people are in it, and I think you could argue that neither bubble is good for the healthy democracy. We're kind of seeing a lot of that play out now.
Yeah, I mean, there's places you can go to see analyses of media bias, and there's a chart. Let's see, where is that chart? There's a media bias chart at Ad Fontes Media. Are you familiar with that?
No.
And if you look at this media bias chart, they sort of show where all of the news organizations are, and which ones are more reliable or less reliable. So it's a very useful thing, but most people are not looking at something like this. They're not really even thinking very hard about whether a news source has a bias, unless they want to contradict that news source, like the guy I was referring to earlier, who, wanted to say that stat news, well, that leans to the left, so you can't believe it. But the difficulty is in figuring out where you can get actual facts that have been properly vetted, and there are those places. I mean, you can go to Associated Press or Reuters. You can go to a number of major newspapers like that, although people argue that they're not. I mean, New York Times or Washington Post may lean a little to the left, but they're really pretty reliable sources, and PBS, NPR is kind of fairly objective, and The Economist is considered fairly objective, though it's a bit conservative.
Yeah, I mean, and NPR, I believe, has one of, like, among in the public that that is interested in following the news, I believe NPR gets consistently pretty highly rated. I mean, people really do notice NPR's coverage and consider it objective, I guess. I mean, there's kind of a few things happening here. One is that, of course, the self-publishing revolution that, Jon and I have actually been a part of back in the aughts, where basically anyone could become a news outlet and a reporter. That, of course, has led to a burgeoning of voices that, and not only that, with a lot of the sophisticated web tools that you can now pay to use, you can look very polished. That can, and there was a period when we thought this was going to be great. Let all these different voices come in. We don't have to lean on the authority of a few gatekeepers to tell us what's important, to tell us who's important. Now it could be from the grassroots up, but as we've seen, there's an unfortunate side to that, where it's equally easy to put up bad information for whatever reason you're doing it. Maybe you're just blathering bad information. Maybe you're doing it on purpose. Maybe you're being employed to do it on purpose. So the question of authority is a difficult one, and I don't really think that news is the only reason we're having a problem in that regard. And I don't think it's only up to news to solve it. News, quality reporters and quality publications, and by quality, I mean reporting stories, getting verifying facts, and trying to put out information, news that's as accurate as it can be. That's the role of the news, essentially.
Well, when we were more innocent about this sort of thing, we thought, man, if you just have a whole bunch of different perspectives on the facts, then you'll be able to synthesize those in your head, and you'll have a much more accurate picture of what's going on. I mean, that was such an innocent, almost quaint assumption.
So, something I've always wondered, is there actually such a thing as non-biased news, non-biased reporters? Because these are all human beings. If you had, I guess, a robot would be non-biased. It was programmed to be. But is there really anyone that doesn't have some sort of bias? You have beliefs, you have stuff that that other people don't know, that would change the way you look at the world.
Well, that's true, but the standards and ethics of journalism that that the best journalists learn are supposed to mitigate against that. Even though everybody knows that there's some subjectivity in anybody's thinking, but you get trained to elude that and to do work that is as objective as you can make it. Some reporters get trained to do that.
Yeah, it's a matter of training. And when you start
throwing those standards out the window and just have a bunch of people decide to be journalists just because they know how to pound keys, then that starts to be a problem. And that's a problem that we have today, is that, you have a lot of people who call themselves journalists or who are writing for, various publications that really have no training in or allegiance to those standards.
Well, you mentioned training, but it also depends on who's doing the training. Are they non-biased? Are they really looking for good journalism, or are they looking to turn you into one of their minions? There's a lot of that out there in the educational scene.
Well, this question of objectivity has just become, in the past few weeks or maybe month, a really hot topic within journalism. The question of can there really be objectivity, and who is setting the terms of what is and isn't objective? And we're in this period right now where the racism that is baked into our society is getting very closely examined and made visible once again, right? Jon, the invisible made visible. And one of the ways that, looking just for instance at how, say, even an unconscious racial bias can affect editorial decision making is it's a question of the choice of what's objective. But yeah, I mean, essentially it's saying, the same things that have made assumptions coming out of sort of Euro-American culture be termed objective in our society broadly. The same dynamics are present in workplaces, and newsrooms are workplaces. And in newsrooms, reporters make decisions about what stories to pitch. Editors make decisions about which stories to green light. And there's just been a lot of intense looking among journalists in kind of our various journalistic back channels, like, online webinars and media critique, newsletters, for instance, a lot of newsletters. We're really starting to examine that question of what's objective, and some of that, in fact, has been brought on because of this crisis we're in of truth, defining what truth is. We've got the people at the person at the very pinnacle of the American system. The president has made it his business to denigrate the press and defame the press and treat facts as fiction and fiction as facts. And that has a trickle-down effect. And there's been also a lot of criticism of how some news outlets responded to that. I would say a lot of national news reporters, or at least their outlets, did not really pivot very quickly enough to dealing with the flood of lies coming out of the Trump administration. And there was, for too long, reporting that stuff as if it were all business as usual. Like, President Obama said a reasonable thing, and then maybe Paul Ryan, the former Congressman Paul Ryan, a Republican, said this relatively reasonable thing in return. Like, we're out of that territory for now. We're in kind of a wholesale epistemological crisis. I've heard some people actually say, or epistemic crisis of the notion of truth being professionally degraded for people who have a vested interest in keeping the public confused. And that's a tough problem. But I know at my outlet, Drilled News, for instance, we cover climate accountability. We cover who's trying to hold fossil fuel industry and their allies in government and in finance, who's trying to hold them accountable for decades of climate denial campaigns, and the present, knowing what we know about climate change and the need to get off these fuels, who's continuing to work with these companies and give them sort of social legitimacy, because they're not doing anything illegal, obviously, but it's accepted in our society that you can continue to produce fossil fuels. I mean, and for some people would call that a bias. They would call us a biased outlet. What I say is we've accepted that one fundamental truth is that if we don't stop pumping carbon-based pollution into the atmosphere, we're headed for a climate disaster. And our position is that the fossil fuel industry lied about that for decades. And that's not just because we want to say it, it's because it's been investigated and it's been found to be true. And now there are actually, a couple court cases have just begun where for instance, the District of Columbia is taking the fossil fuel industry to court on the basis of kind of consumer fraud. Like, people couldn't make informed decisions because the fossil fuel industry was giving them bad information and knowingly. So we say, that's all facts. None of that is arguable at this point. But and that's the perspective from which we're going to do our reporting. And we'll talk to everyone and we'll fact check our work. And we're applying all that kind of standard to our reporting, the standard of accuracy. But we also feel there is a truth in there. And we're gonna represent that truth in our coverage. Now, some people would say that's not fair and balanced, but that fair and balanced isn't the goal. The goal is accurate, independent, truthful reporting.
I guess a commitment to truth could be seen as a bias. And I was watching a thing. I was watching a thing last night on YouTube it was a Joe Rogan episode where they were talking to people from Twitter, and they were talking about Twitter's policies for banning people, removing posts, that sort of, or suspending people. And there was a conversation of, and they were accusing Twitter of having a bias. And part of that conversation was where they were talking about a situation of misgendering, where someone was misgendering another person and doing it in an aggressive way, as a form of bullying. And Twitter's position was that we have a policy against bullying, or we have a policy against particular forms of aggression. So yes, we banned that person. And the other person was saying, well, you banned them because they were misgendering, and that shows a bias on your part. So Twitter's argument was, we are reasonably banning somebody because they are bullying somebody because of an act of aggression. And on the other side of it, which was like a person who professed to have a conservative viewpoint, they're saying, but to us, that's actually a bias on your part. You're showing a bias in favor of a particular idea about gender, that maybe that gender can be fluid, or that a person can be assigned a different gender other than their biological gender.
Sounds like they had a bias against bigotry.
Well, it was just kind of a crazy thing. And it was like, it was like weaponizing the term bias, really.
Yes,
yeah,
that's
there's
a
all
very
kinds
good
of
way to put it.
biases. Yeah. And it's, what are you going to say about something like that? And it's, I mean, I know I argue a lot with people who are arguably supposed to be conservatives, right? I don't really think they are conservatives. I think they're something else. But, there's a lot of sort of like aggressive pushback from people like that. And they're bringing up ideas of bias and that sort of thing. And you're talking about a really good example of that. And that Twitter thing was a really good example of that. They really are sort of weaponizing the whole concept of bias.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I think that's really true. And it's challenging platforms like Twitter, which, they are platforms, but they're not publishers. They are working very hard to try and keep that legal distinction intact, because once they become publishers, they become vulnerable to a whole new set of legal concerns around accuracy.
Or editors, really. I mean, they take responsibility if they take editorial control, which is one of the reasons they use flags instead of actual
Right.
editorial. Yeah.
But it is, you know, that kind of that kind of campaign, you might say, to sort of try and weaponize what seemed like a concept we all basically were in agreement on, the question of what is bias. That is in and of itself a way that people can try to skew sort of the information sphere in their favor, or in the favor of the ideas or people they want to support. And it does sort of, in an ideal world, I guess it would finally compel these social media platforms to take some kind of stand on values, as opposed to sort of just drifting along from crisis to crisis, particularly Facebook. You know, in the past year, we've seen lots and lots of businesses making a positive statement, for instance, about LGBTQ rights, gay rights. And for instance, this is a kind of a very niche example indeed. This website called Ravelry, which is a website where knitters all get together and share knitting information and patterns, and people sell patterns, and it's a whole it's all devoted to knitters. I believe it was last year, certainly within the past couple years, something happened, sort of societally speaking. Maybe it was a court decision or something, and the owners of Knitty, it is a privately owned tiny little company, they basically came out and said, we support LGBTQ rights. Everyone is welcome here, but hate is not welcome here. And we are not going to tolerate certain kinds of speech here, to the extent that it's happening. Because, you know, people don't come to Knitty by and large to talk politics. But of course, when you have forums, politics will be talked. And it was, they were frankly out in the lead. They led every other online operation, as far as I can tell. Hooray, knitters. In just sort of saying, we're taking a stand. This is what we believe. We'd love for you to stay, but if this is, if you cannot accept our what we're going to call acceptable speech here, what we're going to call hate speech, actually, is what it is. If you're not going to accept that what you're doing is hate speech, we regret it, but you'll have to leave.
So they're showing a bias against hate speech.
Yes, exactly. Basically, yeah, they were basically taking a stand against hate speech directed at LGBTQ people, and there was a little bit of an exodus off the site. Some people said they were being censored. Some people said that it was bias. I think it was an expression of values, and the value was, all human beings deserve to be treated with respect, and hate speech is we're not going to tolerate it. And in the end, it's a privately held company, just like Twitter, just like Facebook, and people yell censorship at these companies, but they are not public utilities.
Exactly. A company cannot censor.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, given the definition of censorship,
yeah,
it's not the same. It's editorial. They're making an editorial decision, or they're making a policy decision of some kind.
Well, and
they don't want it to be thought of as an editorial decision, because then you have that DMCA problem.
Right, and it speaks to just how the power of these platforms, that from many we have arrived at just a relative handful all around the world of social media and information platforms, because now we're dependent on those companies, which are in the business of making money. Whatever they say they're in business for, they are in the business of delivering eyeballs to advertisers, and And but they are so powerful, like so much more powerful in terms of how many people they reach, and the dynamic that's happening in the brain when you're taking in that content. You know, that it's different from a newspaper. It's different from how how far a newspaper could get around, you know, an individual copy of a newspaper, even just like, yeah, it's completely different. And we're not, I don't think as a society, we're not adjusted to how to try to maintain civil discourse and civil society with these companies dominating so much of the online space at a time when there is actively people in leadership in the United States and other parts of the world who have a vested interest in confusing the public in order to take on, because they feel it will ultimately help them gain political power, keep political power. So it's a little far afield, but of where we started. But yeah, it's it's hard to know how the problem of Facebook be solved.
The Facebook problem may be getting solved by the advertisers who are boycotting Facebook in a big way.
Yeah, but do I want like civil society to depend on whether Coca-Cola pulls its contract from Facebook? That's
a good point. Yeah.
I mean, yes, if this is a classic activist technique. Target the advertisers, get them to drop whatever it is they're using for advertising. And I can't, so okay, that's a legitimate form of you might say protest or commentary, but again, it's not given the scope that a company given the scope that Facebook in particular has in terms of numbers and penetration into everyday life. It's the stakes are way more higher than before.
The online hate speech that we're talking about has left the online world and reared its ugly head in the real world, out in public. All these people going out who don't want to wear a mask, and they're causing big scenes, throwing a hissy fit, getting in a fist fight with security guards, and they all point, well, you're prejudiced against my rights. You're just seeing that online hate speech just being translated into real world activity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's not mince words. I mean, we're currently in the midst of a presidency that is going out of its way to make things like that happen. And it's the culmination of. We're way far afield of the journalism business at this point, but this is we're kind of right now in the culmination of a decades long effort on the right to build up a right wing media that creates a right wing media bubble, and therefore can lead to enactment of right wing policies. And we're kind of at the apotheosis of that multi-decade effort, which again, I'm not making it up. Books have been written, researchers have explored, and the problem is ultimately, are you working in the system in good faith, right? Are you a good faith actor in publishing, in democracy? And what we're right now in a situation where a lot of people are mouthing the trappings of, a lot of powerful people are mouthing the words of democracy and the words of representing the people, but they're not really doing it. And that, again, that is not a problem that only the news can solve. Newspapers, online news, radio stations, radio news, all the different kinds of news. We can contribute by continuing to report truthfully and accurately about what's going on, by correcting the record when we make a mistake. That's like our role here. But there's a lot of other parts, levels of society that also need to step up. So it's not going to be a problem that the news industry alone solves.
Learn more about Emily's work at emilygertz.com or drillednews.com. Emily will be our guest on the Plutopia News Network Happy Hour on Tuesday, August 18th. You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.